Hi. We're starting this new series, and it's going to be on the Parshiot. And I really hope that we'll be able to look at some different aspects. I want to sort of try to zone in on one aspect, on different aspects of the Parshiot that maybe are overlooked, and hopefully see them in a new light. So that's sort of my goal of what I want to do. So I want to start with, before we get into this week's parasha, I want to start with a few, background introductory ideas. So last week, we just celebrated the Simchat Torah holiday, right? And what is Simchat Torah? Simchat Torah, we're celebrating the fact that we finished the cycle of the Parshiot and we're starting the cycle again. And what about this brings us so much joy, right? And why is this something that we celebrate? And why do we even do this cycle, right? So I want to look at the mitzvah of Hakel, which is a mitzvah in Sefer Devarim, when Moshe talks to the people about that once every 7 years at the end of at the Sukkot, at the end of the Shemitah year, that when they're already there for Aliyah L'Regel, the king is gonna read the Torah and in front of all the nation. And it's gonna be this big grand ceremony. So the thing is what was the goal of this, right? And there's many goals, but I want to just touch upon a couple. Is that it's supposed to, number one, teach the people the Torah, right? Make sure that these people are hearing and learning the Torah, making it accessible to them, right? And number two, it's supposed to give them this whole big ceremony. If you read about it, it's supposed to make them, feel in awe of the Torah and awe of the mitzvot, and obviously in awe of God who gave them to us. So it's sort of that connection and awareness of the Torah in a big way. And it was instituted at different times in history, that eventually that we would read Monday, Thursday, Shabbat, and Rosh Chodesh, and the holidays. We would read different portions of the Torah, right? And similar to that, the goal is to always be teaching us, making Torah accessible, and connecting us to God on a regular basis. Okay, and it's like in some other religions, it was only the priests or only the elite were connected to God, and in Judaism, these mitzvot and these practices that we do are showing that everyone can be connected to God. Everyone should be connected to God in their own individual way, and it's almost like, in a way, like a date night with a spouse, or going out with your friends, and on a regular basis to touch base and to connect and to evaluate and build the relationship. So this is sort of like the idea a little bit of constantly connecting and revisiting to these parshiot, to the parshiot and the Torah. Now, something that maybe we don't think of so consciously, but the reality is that the parshiot are the same. It's the same parshiot every single year, right? We're reading the same stories and the same things every single year. However, so what's the point, right? Why do I keep reading it over and over? Ideally, even though they are the same, we should be constantly evolving and changing. And in that way, that we should be looking at those stories and the mitzvot and the things that they sort of stay the same, and they're the same text, but we as individuals should be changing and looking at them with a new perspective and from a new stance of where we are at that point in our life, right? It's the same thing like if you read a great novel when you're 15, and then when you're 25, and then when you're 35 or whatever, so that you'll gain more of a perspective and a different idea from the novel as you would have when you were for various reasons, maturity, knowledge, so just on and on. So this is what we should be constant. The practice of reading the Parshiot every week is also almost like I don't want to say a challenge, but almost like a need for us to be evaluating ourselves every year and constantly progressing, so that it's not, my daughter was actually saying, yeah, it goes over and over like a circle. Every year we have the same holidays. I guess her teacher must have told her that. She's 5. And it's really, if you think about it, it's more of a spiral, because hopefully, yes, we're touching the same points of the year, of the life, of the parshiot, of the chagim, but we should be going upward as a spiral as opposed to a line. We should be constantly evaluating and going upwards. So that's sort of a goal in why we're doing this, right? So also, by the way, just an example of something that, I learned this, I took this idea off from my dad, is I was preparing for a different series a while back. I forgot exactly which one it was. I think it was a tefillah series I did. And I taught a unit of tefillah when I was living in America. And I had all these notes, a whole notebook of notes at home that I was like, oh, at my mother's house. And I said to my dad, "Oh, shame! I have this whole notebook. I really, I could reference it when I make this new series." And he said, "Well, when did you give it?" I said, "I think it was about 5-6 years ago before I moved." And he said, "Well, if your view and perspective on the topic didn't change in 5-6 years, then you shouldn't be teaching this class." And I took that as a challenge, almost saying, "Yeah, it's true. I shouldn't be thinking and saying the same ideas I said, a few years ago. I should be evolving them and learning more and hopefully, expanding those ideas." So that's, a big introduction to say that it's always important to keep learning and building our knowledge base and our perspectives. So we started Bereshit last week, right? Sefer Bereshit and Parashat Bereshit. And the book has, so to speak, the book itself is about creation, obviously, but it's sort of divided into two sections of creation. We have Perakim 1 through 11, which is basically last week's Bereshit and Noach, the Parashiot of Bereshit and Noach, which are about the creation of the world and humanity, humanity in general. And then from the end, the end Psukim of this week and from next week's parasha till the rest of the book, it talks about the creation of Am Yisrael, right? Of choosing Abraham and Yitzhak, Yaakov, and essentially ending with Bnei Israel, right? With the sons of Yaakov being the nation of the beginning of the nation of Israel as a nation. So we have these two levels of creation here, so to speak. And it's important to realize when we read this book, the Sefer Bereshit is about individual stories, but it's more about paradigms, and it's not necessarily only about these people's lives. It's about what we can learn from them, because these are constructs. These are the building blocks of humanity and human nature. So this is something that we need to look at and learn about the human condition. So when we look at these stories, they shouldn't just be that this is what happened to them. It's saying, how does this express itself in my specific life as a thinking, living, breathing person in this world? And it's interesting that we start, unfortunately, the stories with a lot of people and generations that missed the mark, that were chotim, right? We start with Adam and Chava, Chet of Gan Eden, and we have the flood, right? Well, Cain's sin, right? We have Cain, the first murderer. We have the flood, Dor HaMabul. We have Dor HaFlaga. We have Sodom next week, right? So we have all these negative things, and it's like, well, why are we starting off the story of the world and humanity with all these negative things? And I think it's to show us that these are the challenges that you need to look out for, and what we should be constantly working on our individual selves. So with that whole introduction, I want to look at specifically in this week's parasha, the story of Migdal Babel, of Dor HaFlaga. And what's interesting, and I want to look at what happened there and how it applies to our lives. And what's interesting is that this story is almost a little footnote or a little blip in the listing. If you look at the Psukim, it's the listing of the generations from Noach to Abraham, and it's 9 Psukim. It's a short section, and then it continues on about the listing of the generations till we get to Abraham. So it's a very weird thing. And also, if we read any of the midrashim on this, we see they were chet Dor HaPlaga, and they did bad things and all these things, but very negative. But if you read the psukim, it's very neutral. So almost, it's very here. I'll put up the psukim on the screen. Hold on. It's very neutral almost. Hold on. One second, let me just open this. Okay, the Pesukim are very neutral, right? I mean, I'm not gonna, we'll read them and go through them in a minute, but I want to just in general, I'll summarize it, right? The whole nation was unified. They wanted to build the tower. God saw this tower. they didn't want, he said I'm going to separates them, and now they're dispersed. Okay, so it seemed there's no, I mean, I went through that quickly. We're obviously going to go through it in more detail, but like there's no language that we usually see of Resha, Ra, Vayicharach Hashem, any of this negative language. None of that is there. It's just a listing of events. So what is the atrocity that they did that leads all the Hachamim and all the Midrashim to be so negative about them? So I want to look at the Psukim and see how, and see what really was going on here to show how and why they really were so what was bad about them. Okay, so look at the Psukim. We see Vahi kol haaretz safa achad udvarim achadim, right? All the nation was one language and had unified ideas. So this seems like a very nice thing, right? We want unity. We want to be connected to one another as a nation. However, I actually read from Rav Medan, and he says he looks at it as a negative thing. He looks at it as the unity of a nation under tyrannical rule. So he looks at it as the Midrashim attribute the leader of this time to be Nimrod, and Nimrod was a big rasha, killing people, murderer, wanting everyone to worship everything else besides God, right? So he was the leader of this, according to the Midrashim, of this nation, and they were basically one nation under his tyrannical law to do something negative. So the unity is good, but unfortunately, when there's unity for a negative outcome, that's obviously not so good. And sadly, today we sort of see this of big leaders that are, I mean, I'm not going to get political and say anything specific, but we do see in history and even today leaders that are strong leaders that coerce and fearmonger and carry the nation to do negative things or not necessarily the right thing behind them. So that's sort of what was happening here. So even though unity seemed like a good thing, it was being used for negative. Then we see so they travel Mikedem, and there's a lot of talk about what this Mikedem is. Is Kedem a place? Is Kedem a direction, right? Because Kedma means east, So even if it is a direction, did they travel to the east, from the east? Or was Kedem the Kadmon, like the origin, the original, meaning God, right? From the old ways, from the Yamim Kadmonim, that they wanted to leave the origins of God and move past them. So either way, they wanted to change and get away from the status quo of what was, which at the time was post Mabul, being connected to God. You would think after the Mabul that they're moving past that. And they go to a Bik'ah. Bik'ah is a valley, and the Ereshinat. And now it's very interesting because they go to a valley and then they want to build a tower. So that doesn't seem logical, right? You wouldn't, if you want to build a tower, you're not going to go to a low point. If anything, go to a mountain maybe, right? So we see from this that we're going to talk more about it in a second, but I'm going to touch upon it now and then we'll delve more into it in a minute. We see their goal of the tower wasn't a real practical tower. It was something much more than that. And we see that from the fact that they went to a valley and not somewhere else. So we're going to get back to that in a minute, but just keep that in mind that it's very interesting that they went to a valley and not anywhere else in order to build a tower. Okay, so we'll talk about that in a second. And so now, also I forgot to say this, the language of Vanisiami Kedem and leaving and going from Kedem, we also see that language with Lot, with Abraham, when he leaves when Lot leaves Abraham to go to Sodom. And there too, in a way, it's showing that I'm leaving my moral consciousness, I'm leaving my stability. And the same way that Lot leaves Abraham, who was a man of chesed and tzedakah and all good, Abraham Avinu, and he leaves that and he goes to Sodom, which is the ultimate Ra, ultimate Resha. And here too, they leave this Kedem, they leave this source of good, of morality, and they go to another place. So what happens? We see also we see that it's that it talks about the creation of bricks, okay, which is very weird. It says we're gonna burn them and make them and make avanim and then we'll make a tower. Now, to us, this doesn't seem so revolutionary. We have bricks, but if you're realizing that this is the beginning of innovation, the beginning of technology, right? That now they're realizing their independence, so to speak, from God. They're realizing their own strengths. And so many times, technology and science and innovation causes people to have this idea of right? My own hands and my own abilities did this, as opposed to realizing it's from God. And I'm just going to touch upon this because I think it's just very interesting. But this is just, I bought examples of huge towers in the world. And this is the one, I think, the biggest building at the moment in Dubai. There's no practical purpose for that. That's to show, look how great I am. Look how great I am as a man that I could create this as human, right? That I have the ability to create this. It's for my name. It's not for any practical purpose. And even so, we'll see, we'll talk about it more. This is, oh my God, what was it? The temple of, I can't pronounce that, but it's it's an old Mayan or Incan, I forgot, temple that you see. It's a huge structure. It's very grand. But this was for God. So at least it's not at least, but it's sort of, it had a purpose. It was showing the greatness. It was to worship their God. And there's many around the world, different temples and things and beautiful things that they did for God. This tower, the goal had nothing to do with anything else but themselves. We're going to see that in a minute. And here I bought, which is interesting because it was like about a few weeks ago, SpaceX, right? That the new independent spaceship, space company, they've been launching independent rockets into space the past few weeks. One of them, this is the Crew Dragon, which I was reading about, which is so interesting. That I forgot his name, but he's a billionaire. The first guy here, this guy, I forgot his name, but he's a billionaire, and he bought 4 seats, and he won on one of these these spaceships, and he said, "I want to make the first civilian crew to go up to space." Now, that's very cool, and it's very amazing, and it's awesome. But you see, and if you read any articles about it, yes, he wants to. I'm not bashing him at all. He did an amazing thing, and he actually did a lot of publicity for St. Jude's Hospital to raise money, and that's amazing. But you see, in a way, this is sort of our modern Migdal Babel. Like, what can I do as human? What technological leaps can I do? Meaning me, not God, not my ability to connect to God, but me, my individual ability. What can I do to be better and be better than everyone else? And this is a very important thing. It's a creative force that we have as individuals and as humans. However, we have to know how to use it and channel it to God. So let's talk more about that. So it then says, what do they say? They make this innovation, they're building this technology, and they say, we're going to make a city, Migdal, and a tower with a shoba shamayim. And the tower is going to go up to the sky. And that we'll make a name for ourselves so we won't spread around the world. So what's their goals here? Make a name for themselves, and so they won't scatter. So what is the problem the Chachamim see with these goals? Why do the Chachamim say that these goals are a bad thing? We see that number one, if we look at the idea of Naseh Lanu Shem, to make a name, if we see that at other points in the Torah, it all has to do with Shem, of God, right? Abraham goes and he publicizes the name of God, right? And so they're doing it the total opposite. They're doing Naseh Lanu Shem and not for God. And also, what is wrong with the pen nafutz pnei al pnei haaretz? Why should they don't want to be spread out? Because this is going against the first mitzvah that God tells us of haaretz. Go inhabit the land. Go create the land. Don't stay insular. Okay, go out and create and build the world, not build your own world. Right? You see the difference? And so, the Midrash continues, and it says, what was their actual level of rebellion? They wanted to go, what was the bad about it? And the Midrash says 3 things, which I think are all connected. It says they wanted to wage war against Hashem, against God. They wanted to go to the heavens and take his place and sit in his place, so to speak. And they wanted to go up there and worship Avodah Zarah, meaning in his face to worship Avodah Zarah. So what do all these things have in common? It's essentially removing the responsibility that God placed upon you and worshiping your own desires, right? God, this is essentially the creation of Avodah Zarah, right? What is Avodah Zarah? Avodah Zarah is a foreign worship, meaning not worshiping God, worshiping something foreign from God. What is foreign from God? it's foreign that we're worshiping my own brain, my own self, my own ideals, um, um, my own passions and ideas and all these things, as opposed to God's. I'm worshiping them. It's not that I shouldn't have these things. Of course you should. But when you worship them and when you make them the be all end all and you want to void God of that, that's the problem. That's when Avodah Zarah comes. So we see that rebellion is not, I was reading in, I think it was Rav Hendler, I think so. He was talking about that rebellion, this rebellion here is not the opposite of emunah, not the opposite of belief. They believed in God. They knew God's greatness. They were, if you think about the Midrashim, they were the nation coming off the flood, right? And he says, when you talk about Nesiyah Mikedem, that leaving Kedem, what did they leave? They left the cities surrounding Har Ararat, right? The Mabul ends, the Tevaz on Har Ararat, they come out and they start rebuilding civilization. And so you could imagine, this is all Midrash, so it's not in the Pshat, but I'm just saying a lot of these, where these things come from, is what it's trying to teach us is, so imagine they're living after the flood, they're living, rebuilding the world, and they're looking at the mountain as a constant reminder of what God did to the world, and the fact that I need to stand up and be accountable and acknowledge this relationship I have to God. They don't want that. So this rebellion is coming out of anger, maybe, or fear, or insecurity of being a partner with God. I don't want, they're saying, so to speak, I don't want to be a partner with God. It's too hard. I want to be myself. I want to be away and do what I want to do and not deal with a partnership. Relationships are hard, right? Anyone who's in a relationship knows that there's challenges, and that when you're dealing with another person, that you have to hear other point of views. You have to be open. You have to see outside your own self, and that's challenging, right? And I actually was just listening. There's this guy, the Gotham Institute, which is he talks about he brings all these different advice on relationships and whatever, and he gives these very interesting podcasts. It's called Small Things Often. If anyone wants to, it's a 4 to 5 minute podcast a day where they give you a tip about relationships, and it could apply to relationships, romantic, marriage, and that, or with your kids. It's very interesting. And it was just funny. I didn't even plan to say this, but I thought of it now. Is the one I was talking about today was the ability to realize that conflict is not necessarily a sign of a bad relationship, because there's always going to be conflict when there's two different people involved and two different entities. So even more so, it's challenging to have a relationship with God, the ultimate being, and we're humans, right? So this is hard, and they don't want to be necessarily accountable. They want to go away from that and build their own standards. And so this is what they're doing, and what's the big deal. It is a big deal. And we see that God acknowledges this, right? God says, "Vayered Hashem lirot et ha'ir ve'et ha'migdal asher banu bnei Adam." He goes to see, and Vayomer Hashem. By the way, just interesting. Anytime it says Vayered Hashem, we know there's a big shift in the world, like in what's going on, because it also said that Vayered with Sodom and with Chet HaEgel. So it's just interesting to know there's going to be a big shift now. Vayomer Hashem, God says, this is Am Svafa Achat, the Kulam, that lo yivaseh mihem kol asher yizemu lasot. God acknowledges if they stay this way, united like this, there's nothing that's going to stand in their way of continuing to build this, this world that's worshiping and building only on themselves, void of God. And so what he does is he says, I'm gonna nirdav and nivelasa asham slatam asher lo yishmu ish sefareo, and that vayfizotam misham al pnei adama. He's gonna separate them and disperse them on the earth. And we see, in a way, this is interesting, which is why I think, actually I'll go back to that in a second, but you see, this isn't necessarily a punishment for what they did for a past action. It's a punishment or a preventative measure, so to speak, of not letting it get to that point. God is saying this could happen and this will happen inevitably if they keep building this type of society. So I have to separate them so that this won't happen. And this is something similar happened with Adam, right? After Chet Etzadat, God kicks him out of Gan Eden, right? Because it says, God acknowledges the strengths of humanity and says, if you take this too far, you will become godly, in the sense you'll think you're your own gods, and you'll lose any connection to God, to me, the real God. And he takes him out of Gan Eden, and he, so that these things that won't happen. And we see here, hold on, we see here is that, why do I keep doing that? Okay, we see here is that um I lost my train of thought. Sorry. Okay. So I want to go back to something that we started with, and I want to sort of tie it all together. Is that we said in the beginning that these are 9 psukim that are stand out in the list of the generations till Abraham, right? And I think, and I want to focus on that for a second, and the fact that, like I said, there's no actual sign, words of chet, vayechar af. It all seems very neutral. So why? Ideally, before this chet, after chet hamabul, God, the ideal world would be that all of creation, all of humanity would acknowledge and know God and be connected to God, right? And partners in his creation, right? And when this happens and they're focusing on their own Shem and trying to erase God from that equation, God says, I can't do this. And it's obviously not that they can't do this. They can't be partners with me. And I have to separate them and find not all humanity is going to be partners with me, but one person and one nation, which is obviously Abraham, which we'll talk about in later Pashiyot. But Abraham's whole, mission in life is to spread God's name, right, and not his own name. And we see that is why I think that this is not necessarily a straight out sin, and it's so clear as a sin, because this is the creative nature and the ability for humans to advance and build is the goal of humanity. It is important that we should be partners with God in creation, but that's what we should be, partners, not individuals. And that's why the line, it's a very blurry line for this unity, to be a unity for God and for spreading God's name, or a unity to spread my own name. And that's why I think it's written so neutral in this way, is because it doesn't want to come out as such that these things are so negative, because they could be very positive, but you have to really walk that line very carefully. And I think, to go back and to sum up what we spoke about in the beginning, of the fact that all these stories are paradigms and are pieces of the human condition that we have to look within ourselves. And it's not only about this generation of Dora Plaga, it's about what things I have to take from that in my own human nature and human failings. And we see that it's very, very easy on obviously a global level, but in individual level, that to get caught up in worshiping yourself as opposed to worshiping God, and to seeing how easy it is to focus on my individuality and how awesome I am and what I need and what I can do, and I, me, as opposed to seeing how that could translate and connect to God and my mission in the world as his partner. And we really have to be conscious of these things, because they are very, very subtle. Because at first glance, when we read the story, it sounds like people that are building a city, and that's great, that are advancing in technology, and that's great. But when you see the subtleties, that's where the problem lies, in the subtleties and in the intention. And what is my intention? What is my goal for what I'm doing, right? It's not only about the action, it's about what's the intention and thought behind that action. So I think as individuals, and it's very hard to do, because it's very hard to fully be honest with ourselves sometimes with our intentions, because it's very easy to justify certain things. Obviously, something that's very, very extremely negative, it's hard to justify. People do, but it's harder to justify. But when it's something that's nuanced, you could sort of say, oh yeah, I'm doing this, for whatever reason, right? To give to this charity or to help this thing out. But really, you're doing it to show how great you are, or to, just, a tried example. But I think we all have to really look within ourselves, myself included, and really see in what areas of my life am I covering certain failings in myself, or certain ego, parts of myself that need to be dealt with, to better commitment to my role as someone who's bringing God's name into this world, and not someone who's bringing my own name into this world. So yeah, I really think it's definitely not easy. It's definitely a challenge, and it's something that I think that we'll talk about as we see about building the nation. About that, this is what the Avot had. This is what the Avot were able to work with and to understand, so that they could continue that. Um, so yeah, I think we're gonna end here. And thank you for coming. Hope to see you next time.